The oppressive heat of June 22, 1944, found Field Marshal Ernst Busch at Army Group Center headquarters in Minsk, receiving reports of massive Soviet artillery bombardment across the entire front from the Baltic to the Pripyat marshes. The barrage exceeded anything German forces in the east had experienced, involving thousands of guns firing simultaneously in preparation for infantry and armored assaults that intelligence had warned were coming, but the German command had been unable to prepare adequately to meet. Busch, who commanded the army group holding the central sector of the Eastern Front, who had been ordered by Hitler to defend every position without withdrawal, and who commanded forces stretched thin by transfers of divisions to other theaters, was learning within hours that the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, represented a coordinated assault of scale and sophistication that Wehrmacht forces in their current weakened state could not withstand. 3 years to the day after Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, Soviet forces were demonstrating how completely the strategic balance had shifted, how thoroughly the Red Army had evolved from desperate defender to confident attacker, and how decisively German military power in the East had been degraded by attrition and by strategic decisions that had stripped the Eastern Front of reserves to meet threats in the West and in Italy. The strategic context that shaped the German response to the Soviet summer offensive reflected catastrophic misallocation of forces and a fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet intentions. German intelligence through the spring of 1944 had anticipated that the main Soviet summer effort would come in Ukraine, where terrain favored mobile operations and where strategic objectives, including Romanian oil fields, made offensive operations attractive. Based on this assessment, German reserves and strongest formations had been positioned in the southern sector, while Army Group Center in Belarus held an extended front with forces that were under strength, poorly equipped, and lacking mobile reserves that could respond to Soviet breakthroughs. The German dispositions reflected both intelligence failure about where the Soviets would attack and command rigidity that prevented rapid redeployment when actual Soviet intentions became clear. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group North Ukraine south of Army Group Center, had warned in May that Soviet preparations in Belarus suggested a major offensive was being prepared against Busch's front rather than against his own sector. Model's intelligence staff had detected Soviet troop movements toward Belarus, observed construction of supply depots and forward airfields that would support major operations, and noted radio traffic patterns suggesting concentration of forces opposite Army Group Center. Model's warnings to OKH that the main Soviet effort might come in the center rather than in the south had been received, but had not resulted in significant reinforcement of Busch's forces, because Hitler and OKH remained convinced that Ukraine was the critical sector. The intelligence that reached German commanders through late May and early June documented Soviet preparations that should have prompted emergency reinforcement of Army Group Center. The reports described the arrival of Soviet tank armies in Belarus, concentration of artillery in numbers far exceeding what would be needed for local operations, and stockpiling of ammunition and fuel sufficient for sustained offensive operations. The intelligence indicated that Soviet forces opposite Army Group Center would possess overwhelming numerical superiority in infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Yet the German response was limited by Hitler's insistence that forces in Ukraine could not be moved north, and a command structure that prioritized the Führer's strategic judgment over assessments from field commanders who understood operational realities. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, commanding the Fourth Army in the center of Busch's front, had calculated by mid-June that his forces were outnumbered approximately 5-1 in infantry and 10-1 in armor by Soviet forces massing opposite his positions.
Tippelskirch reported to Busch that his army lacked reserves to contain a major Soviet breakthrough, that defensive positions were not adequately fortified because labor and materials had not been available, and that withdrawal to more defensible positions should be authorized before the Soviet offensive began. Busch forwarded Tippelskirch's recommendations to OKH with endorsement that tactical withdrawals were militarily necessary. But Hitler's response was to reaffirm that every position must be held and that fortress cities designated as strongpoints must be defended regardless of operational situation. General Hans Jordan, commanding the Ninth Army on Fourth Army's southern flank, transmitted similar assessments that Soviet forces preparing to attack his sector possessed overwhelming superiority that his weakened divisions could not contain. Jordan noted that his army had lost its strongest divisions to transfers to other sectors, that replacements had been inadequate in number and training, and weapons and equipment losses from earlier battles had not been made good. Jordan's assessment was that the Ninth Army could conduct delaying actions but could not prevent a Soviet breakthrough, and authorization for flexible defense, including withdrawals when positions became untenable, was essential to preserving any combat capability. The fortress city concept that Hitler had imposed on Army Group Center represented command rigidity that would prove catastrophic when the Soviet offensive began. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk were designated as fortresses to be held at all costs, with substantial German forces garrisoned in each city under orders to fight in place, regardless of whether Soviet forces bypassed them or encircled them. The concept assumed that fortresses would tie down Soviet forces and anchor the German defensive line. But the operational reality was that garrisoning fortresses committed German forces to positions where they could be isolated and destroyed, while contributing nothing to mobile defense that might have prevented Soviet breakthroughs. General Friedrich Gollwitzer, commanding the garrison at Vitebsk, received orders in mid-June emphasizing that the city must be held and that withdrawal, even if Soviet forces achieved encirclement, was forbidden. Gollwitzer understood that being trapped in the fortress by Soviet mobile forces would result in destruction of his garrison, that the defensive value of holding Vitebsk did not justify sacrificing the divisions assigned to its defense, and that the operationally sound approach would be to use those forces as a mobile reserve rather than tying them to static defense. His protests were dismissed with the reminder that the Führer's orders were to be obeyed regardless of tactical situation. The June 22 Soviet offensive began with artillery preparation that German defenders described as unlike anything they had experienced even in earlier massive Soviet operations. The bombardment involved over 20,000 artillery pieces firing for hours against German forward positions, command posts, communication centers, and logistics facilities. The psychological and material effects were devastating. Communication lines were severed, defensive positions were obliterated, German forces in forward areas were suppressed or destroyed before Soviet infantry assault even began. The intensity of the bombardment demonstrated Soviet artillery capabilities that had grown exponentially since the early war and now exceeded German capabilities by a wide margin. The Soviet infantry and armored assaults that followed achieved breakthroughs across the entire Army Group Center front within hours. Soviet combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, overwhelmed German defensive positions that lacked depth, reserves, or adequate firepower to contain attacks. Multiple simultaneous breakthroughs prevented German forces from concentrating against any single penetration, creating an operational crisis that Field Marshal Busch lacked the resources to address. The first reports that reached Busch's headquarters on June 22 to 23 documented a catastrophic situation developing across the front. 3rd Panzer Army reported Soviet breakthroughs threatening to encircle Vitebsk. 4th Army reported multiple penetrations with Soviet mobile forces exploiting into rear areas. 9th Army reported that its defensive line had been breached and that Soviet forces were advancing toward Bobruisk. Each report indicated that local reserves had been committed and consumed without restoring the situation, that defensive positions were collapsing, and that withdrawal might preserve some forces if authorized immediately. Busch's requests for withdrawal authorization were denied. The result was rapid collapse. The encirclement and destruction of Vitebsk and Bobruisk followed within days, resulting in tens of thousands of casualties and demonstrating that fortress cities had become traps rather than defensive anchors. The Soviet advance penetrated deep into German rear areas, destroying command structures and isolating entire formations. By late June, Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Field Marshal Walter Model was appointed to replace Busch on June 28, but arrived to find that 28 divisions had already been destroyed or encircled, and that Soviet forces were advancing toward Minsk with minimal German resistance remaining. Model's efforts focused on stabilizing remnants and establishing defensive positions farther west, but the catastrophic losses could not be reversed. The fall of Minsk symbolized the complete collapse of German defenses in the central sector. The scale of the disaster exceeded even Stalingrad, with approximately 350,000 German casualties and massive losses of equipment. The offensive demonstrated that the Red Army had mastered operational warfare at a level equal to or exceeding that of the Wehrmacht, and that Germany no longer possessed the resources to counter such offensives effectively. German commanders increasingly understood that they were no longer fighting to win the war, but to delay defeat.